It was the early months of 1944, and the English coastline was wrapped in a quiet tension that belied the scale of the storm to come. As American generals disembarked from transport planes onto British soil, the cool, damp air carried the scent of the sea and the faint tang of coal smoke from distant industrial towns. Every gust seemed to whisper history, as if the land itself had been preparing for this day for centuries. To these commanders, veterans of campaigns in Africa and Italy, Britain was both familiar and alien, a steadfast ally, yet a theatre of war unlike any they had known. From the moment their convoy wound through narrow country lanes, dotted with stone cottages and rolling green fields, it became immediately apparent that the ordinary landscapes of Britain had been transformed. Farmhouses were now observation posts, their barns converted into storage depots stacked high with crates of ammunition and rations. The generals observed soldiers moving with mechanical precision, yet carrying a human weight in their faces, the awareness of history pressing down on each man. Vehicles of all sizes rumbled along camouflaged roads, their movements orchestrated as if by an unseen conductor, every jeep, truck, and tank in constant, deliberate motion. The sprawling military bases stretched for miles, seeming to consume the countryside entirely. Tent cities dotted the landscape, taut with ropes and flapping against the wind, housing thousands of soldiers, engineers, and support personnel. At first glance, it was the chaos of 1,000 simultaneous operations, but the generals quickly understood the underlying order, a meticulous choreography of logistics and manpower. Every crate, every rifle, every ration was accounted for, catalogued, and placed precisely where it would be needed for the coming invasion. They had heard stories of Britain's dedication, but seeing it with their own eyes evoked a mixture of awe and disbelief. And then there were the airfields. Lines of aircraft stood like silent sentinels under grey skies. Spitfires and bombers gleamed with the sheen of fresh paint, engines humming in anticipation of missions yet to come. Pilots walked among them with calm determination, though the generals noted the tension in their shoulders, the slight clench of jaws betraying the mental preparation beneath disciplined exteriors. Each plane represented not just a tactical asset, but a lifeline in the enormous gamble that was about to unfold on the beaches of Normandy. As they traveled further, the generals encountered the first signs of deception: dummy tanks, fake artillery, and wooden landing craft cleverly camouflaged. At first, some smirked, thinking it a simple ruse for morale or propaganda, but the officers in Britain explained with quiet seriousness. Every decoy was a calculated move to mislead German reconnaissance, a silent war waged in shadows, just as decisive as the battles yet to come. The Americans nodded slowly, impressed by the foresight and ingenuity on display. Encounters with British commanders offered another revelation. In briefing rooms lined with maps, pins, and strings tracing the movements of entire armies, the Americans felt the enormity of the planning. Every possible contingency had been anticipated. Whether forecasts were studied for months in advance, supplies were stockpiled to withstand delays, routes were plotted with the precision of a clockmaker. In these rooms, beneath the harsh glare of electric bulbs, strategy was not just an abstraction, it was a tangible, almost living entity, pulsing through the hands of the men who had conceived it. By nightfall, as the generals looked out over the patchwork of camps and airfields, the English countryside transformed again. Lanterns glowed softly like constellations fallen to earth, soldiers moved silently along their paths, and the distant sound of waves crashing against cliffs added a haunting rhythm. Here, in this suspended moment, the generals realized the truth. They were standing at the edge of history. The sheer scale of Britain's preparations, the discipline of its people, the audacity of its plans, it was almost beyond comprehension. For some, a sense of pride welled up. For others, a quiet fear. The coming invasion would demand courage, sacrifice, and the unflinching acceptance of uncertainty. In those hours, as the wind carried the faint whistle of distant artillery practice, the American generals spoke little. Words seemed inadequate. They had arrived expecting coordination, strategy, and perhaps some degree of order. Instead, they found something more profound, a nation mobilized not merely for war, but for destiny itself. Britain's D-Day preparations were not just plans on paper. They were a living testament to ingenuity, endurance, and the human capacity to confront the impossible. As the generals retired to their quarters that night, the images lingered in their minds. Sprawling camps under grey skies, lines of vehicles and troops moving in perfect harmony, and the first glimpses of the silent deception that would soon fool an entire enemy army. They would carry these images forward, not as spectators, but as participants in an endeavor whose scale and significance would echo through the annals of history. And though the night was quiet, the air was electric with anticipation, the calm before the storm that would change the course of the Second World War. The early morning fog clung stubbornly to the fields of southern England. masking the intricate ballet of men, machines, and materiel that had transformed this tranquil countryside into a theater of preparation. As American generals rode alongside British officers, they were immediately confronted by the scale and precision of logistics, a silent army of organization as vital to victory as the soldiers who would storm the beaches of Normandy. Here, in these sprawling depots and supply yards, the raw machinery of war was orchestrated with a meticulousness that seemed almost obsessive, yet profoundly necessary. Crates upon crates of ammunition were stacked like monolithic sculptures, each carefully labeled, inventoried, and stored according to type, weight, and anticipated time of deployment. Vehicles lined up in regimented rows, jeeps, trucks, tanks gleaming under the grey morning sky, their engines silently ready. Soldiers moved with deliberate efficiency, navigating a choreography dictated by schedules and manifests that could rival the precision of a Swiss watch. The American generals observed this with a mixture of astonishment and quiet reverence. They had seen supply lines before, in deserts and mountains, but nothing on this scale, nothing so immaculately controlled. Rail lines snaked through the countryside, delivering men and materials from the ports to inland staging areas. The generals watched as massive trains disgorged tons of supplies, barrels of fuel, stacks of food rations, boxes of medical supplies, artillery shells, all moving with mechanical regularity, guided by British logisticians whose focus was unbroken by the chaos surrounding them. These were not just depots. They were living, breathing ecosystems of war, where the loss of even a single item could ripple into catastrophe on the battlefield. In conversation with British quartermasters, the Americans learned of the painstaking calculations behind every shipment. How many tons of rations would sustain a division for days on the beaches? How much fuel was required to power tanks through the hedgerows of Normandy? Every question had been considered, every variable anticipated. The generals listened, sometimes silently, sometimes nodding in appreciation, occasionally scribbling notes to themselves. These were lessons in preparation they would carry back to their own commands. The ports, too, revealed the immensity of Britain's undertaking. Massive docks, usually reserved for trade and commerce, had been converted into hubs of military efficiency. Landing crafts, barges, and supply ships were lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. Cranes swung enormous loads with rhythmic precision, while dockworkers, civilian and military alike, hustled tirelessly, loading and unloading with the urgency of men aware that each crate carried not just supplies, but the lives of soldiers who would soon storm foreign shores. The generals were struck by the seamless integration of civilian industry into the machinery of war, a testament to the totality of Britain's mobilization. Fuel depots, ammunition stores, and medical stations were arranged in a meticulous network, each connected by concealed roads and camouflaged routes. Observing these preparations, the generals began to understand that victory would not be won solely by courage or firepower, but by the quiet, unseen diligence of men who labored tirelessly behind the scenes. Every gallon of fuel, every crate of shells, every bandage and surgical kit was a thread in a vast tapestry of survival and success. Even the smallest details had been considered. Engineers demonstrated how sandbags would fortify supply points, how mobile kitchens would feed thousands, how field hospitals were strategically placed to treat casualties quickly. Nothing was left to chance. The calculations were exhaustive, the rehearsals rigorous. The Americans could feel the tension in the air, a quiet undercurrent of anxiety and anticipation. Every soldier moving through the camps carried the weight of preparation, and every officer overseeing operations bore the burden of responsibility for the lives that would depend on these plans. Perhaps most astonishing to the American generals was the sheer adaptability of the logistics network. Temporary airfields had been carved from farmland, roads widened or camouflaged, depots repositioned in anticipation of enemy reconnaissance. Even in the face of potential German countermeasures, the British system was fluid, capable of bending without breaking, a living proof of foresight and ingenuity. The generals whispered among themselves, realizing that this level of preparation was unparalleled, a force multiplier that could determine the outcome of the entire campaign. As the day drew on, shadows lengthening over the neatly arranged supply lines and encampments, the generals paused on a ridge overlooking the sprawling scene. Thousands of men, hundreds of vehicles, tons of materiel, all moving in silent concert, gave the impression of a breathing organism, immense and powerful, yet fragile in its dependence on human precision. They felt a sense of awe, tinged with apprehension. Every crate unloaded, every convoy routed, every ration accounted for would be a determinant of survival on the beaches of Normandy. The fog thickened as evening approached, wrapping the countryside in a damp veil, but the sense of movement never ceased. Lights flickered along roads and in the tents, and distant engines hummed like a low, continuous heartbeat. The American generals realized that this logistical machine, invisible from the maps they had studied, was the true backbone of D-Day. Courage and strategy would be tested, yes, but without the unrelenting discipline of supply and preparation, the invasion would crumble before it began. In the silence of the approaching night, the generals found themselves contemplating the enormity of what lay ahead. They had witnessed the dedication, ingenuity, and sheer scale of Britain's preparations, a revelation that was as inspiring as it was humbling. The machinery of war, they understood now, was not merely metal and manpower. It was a testament to human perseverance, planning, and the unyielding will to shape history itself. The sun had barely risen over southern England when the American generals were led into the nerve centers of Britain's secret war, rooms filled with maps, strings, and models that seemed more like the playthings of mad architects than the instruments of strategy. Here, the invisible hand of deception shaped the battlefield before a single soldier had stepped onto Normandy soil. Operation Fortitude, the sprawling campaign of misdirection, was not a rumor, not a theoretical exercise. It was alive, breathing, and pulsating with purpose, and the generals were about to witness its extraordinary scale. The first demonstration was simple, almost absurd at first glance. Dummy tanks, their wooden frames painted to gleam like steel in the sunlight, lined the fields outside a modest farmhouse. Fake artillery pieces, canvas and timber, pointed at invisible enemies. Landing crafts, hollow and immobile, were positioned along the coastlines. A casual observer might have laughed. But the generals, after the British officers explained the meticulous calculations behind every decoy, felt the weight of this silent stratagem. Each dummy was not just a trick. It was a calculated lie aimed at an enemy thousands of miles away, a ghost army designed to mislead the most sophisticated reconnaissance of the Nazi war machine. Inside the intelligence offices, the atmosphere was tense but precise. Maps covered the walls, pins marking units, and strings crisscrossed in patterns that resembled a spider's web. Analysts whispered over documents and intercepted communications, their work a delicate dance of interpretation and anticipation. The generals were briefed on the scale of British intelligence operations, code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park, intercepting German communications, and fabricating entire army groups to create the illusion of attacks where none were planned. Every movement, every false signal, every carefully planted rumor was a weapon in a war that existed entirely in the mind of the enemy. The generals walked through the rehearsal grounds where decoy operations were tested. Soldiers moved through fake towns, pretending to prepare for invasions at Calais instead of Normandy. Inflatable tanks swayed slightly in the wind, casting convincing shadows, while radio operators transmitted fabricated chatter to simulate troop concentrations. The Americans could hardly conceal their astonishment. The ingenuity, audacity, and patience required to pull off such an elaborate ruse was staggering. They whispered among themselves, noting that this war was as much a battle of perception as of firepower. British officers explained how every deception was synchronized with the movements of real troops, ensuring that any reconnaissance, aerial or human, would be confused, misled, and paralyzed by uncertainty. Even the smallest details were considered: fake tracks in the mud, campfires that burned at night to mimic activity, and dummy supply depots that seemed ready to support non-existent divisions. The generals watched closely, realizing that the enemy's eyes were everywhere, and Britain had crafted a network of illusions capable of fooling even the most seasoned German intelligence officers. One demonstration that left a lasting impression was a simulated army camp in the marshlands near the coast. Inflatable vehicles, canvas tents, and lifelike mannequins arranged in precise formations created the impression of thousands of troops preparing to strike Calais. Reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead at prearranged times, photographing the scene as though it were genuine. The American generals studied the photos and models, their faces a mixture of incredulity and respect. They began to understand that the success of D-Day might hinge not only on courage and firepower, but on the ability to manipulate perception itself. Even inside the high-tech operations centers, the generals were struck by the level of coordination. Every deception, every code-breaking initiative, every rumor planted in the minds of German officers was tied into a single vision: the Normandy landings. They observed analysts comparing intercepted messages with troop deployments, constantly adjusting strategies to maintain the illusion of strength where it did not exist. It was a game of intellect, foresight, and subtlety on a scale they had never imagined. The most profound realization came as they were led to a room showing the integration of intelligence and deception with real operations. Maps of supply routes, troop movements, and air support plans intertwined with areas of misdirection and dummy deployments. Every signal was calculated, every shadow accounted for. The generals felt a growing awe at the mental machinery behind the scenes, understanding that war was not just fought with bullets and bombs, but with minds capable of seeing multiple steps ahead, predicting reactions and bending reality to their will. By the end of the day, as the fog rolled back in from the English Channel, the American generals were left in a state of quiet reflection. The genius of Britain's deception operations was clear. It demanded imagination, patience, and absolute attention to detail. It was a war fought in silence, unseen by the world, yet decisive in its potential to save countless lives and secure victory. The generals understood now that what they had witnessed was more than preparation. It was an art form, a demonstration that strategy could exist as a living, breathing force, capable of shaping perception as surely as any gun could shape the battlefield. As they departed the intelligence centers, the Americans could not help but glance back at the fields where wooden tanks swayed in the wind and dummy camps glimmered in the fading light. What they had seen was not illusion in the ordinary sense, but a deliberate, calculated manipulation of reality, a prelude to the greatest military deception the world had ever known. And in that quiet awe, the weight of the coming invasion pressed down upon them, mingling excitement, fear, and an unshakable respect for the minds that had engineered such a masterpiece of strategic foresight. The early morning mist clung to the English coastline like a shroud, masking the rhythmic thunder of boots, the metallic rattle of rifles, and the distant roar of landing craft engines. For the American generals, observing the British and Allied troops at training grounds was like stepping into another world, a place where discipline, endurance, and raw courage were being forged into the instruments of history. Every drill, every rehearsal, was an exercise in anticipation, a rehearsal for the chaos that awaited them on the beaches of Normandy. Amphibious landing exercises were underway on secluded stretches of sand and rocky inlets. Soldiers moved in perfect synchrony, wading through freezing surf, carrying heavy packs and weapons, while instructors shouted commands that cut through the roar of the waves. Landing craft nosed into the shore, disgorging men in formations practiced to precision, their movements timed down to the second. The generals observed, their eyes narrowing with concentration, understanding that every misstep, every hesitation, could mean disaster in the actual operation. Artillery units fired over ranges marked by red flags, while engineers constructed makeshift obstacles and cleared simulated minefields. Each exercise was repeated over and over until every action became instinct, every movement second nature. Generals noted the strain etched into the soldiers' faces, fatigue, determination, and an unspoken acknowledgement that their training was preparation not just for combat, but for survival under unimaginable pressure. The Americans whispered to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The scale and intensity of this preparation far exceeded any drill they had ever seen. Live-fire exercises added another layer of intensity. Troops moved through mock villages, ducking behind walls, advancing under simulated enemy fire. Smoke and explosions filled the air, obscuring vision and heightening the senses. Generals watched as soldiers adapted instantly to changing conditions, making split-second decisions that could save lives in real combat. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support was flawless, a testament to months of meticulous planning and repeated rehearsals. The generals were also introduced to specialized units, engineers who could construct temporary bridges under fire, demolition teams trained to clear obstacles in the surf, and medical units rehearsing casualty evacuation. Each component of the invasion force was being honed to perfection, every soldier drilled in his specific role, and yet always aware of the larger picture. The Americans felt a profound respect for the British command's ability to integrate these disparate elements into a cohesive fighting force. Naval rehearsals took place along the coast as well, with landing craft navigating choppy waters and practicing coordinated beach assaults. Commanders shouted orders over the wind and surf, their voices carrying both authority and urgency. The American generals studied the maneuvers closely, impressed by the ingenuity of the landing strategies and the precise timing required to avoid catastrophic losses. The engineers had built obstacles along the shoreline that perfectly mimicked the conditions expected at Normandy, forcing troops to innovate under pressure. Even the psychological aspects of training were evident. Soldiers were exposed to the chaos of simulated bombardments, night operations, and sudden shifts in strategy, preparing them for the unexpected horrors of battle. Observing these rehearsals, the American generals could see how discipline and mental toughness were cultivated alongside physical skill. They understood now that D-Day would not only test strength and courage, but resolve, adaptability, and the capacity to act under fear and confusion. In briefing rooms adjacent to the training grounds, maps and models illustrated every exercise. The generals saw the connections between the drills and the larger operational plan, timing of landings, artillery support, naval bombardments, and air cover. Every rehearsal had been designed with a purpose, each repetition a refinement of tactics, each obstacle a lesson in adaptability. They noted the intensity of communication between units, the seamless coordination across branches, and the almost obsessive attention to detail that defined British preparations. By late afternoon, the sun pierced through lingering clouds, casting long shadows over the rehearsal beaches. The generals walked along the shore, observing soldiers dragging themselves from surf to sand, helmets heavy and faces strained, yet moving with unwavering determination. It was a scene of preparation that was both brutal and beautiful, a ballet of courage under the looming spectre of war. They understood that these exercises, though exhausting and exacting, were essential. Every moment spent in training was an investment in survival, in victory, and in the lives of thousands yet to be sacrificed or saved. As evening fell, the generals gathered to reflect on what they had witnessed. The scale, intensity, and precision of the training were staggering. They realized that D-Day would demand not just strategy, but human endurance and coordination on a scale never before seen. For the American commanders, these moments offered both reassurance and solemn warning. The soldiers were ready, yet the stakes were immense, and the cost of failure would be catastrophic. In that fading light, as waves lapped against the shore and the distant sound of marching boots echoed across the sands, the generals could feel the weight of history pressing down. They had seen the human and mechanical machinery of war in motion, rehearsing for a day that would change the world. And they knew that when the invasion began, there would be no room for error, no margin for hesitation, only courage, coordination, and the relentless execution of months of preparation. The morning was crisp, the sky a muted grey over southern England, as American generals arrived at one of the nerve centres of Allied planning, a sprawling complex of briefing rooms, communication hubs, and war rooms where strategy was not just discussed, but lived, breathed, and constantly recalibrated. Here the true scale of command revealed itself, the invisible threads that would connect air, land, and sea into a single, unstoppable force poised to change the course of history. Maps covered every wall, their surfaces dotted with pins, strings, and handwritten notes detailing troop movements, supply routes, and expected resistance. Large tables were strewn with miniature models of landing craft, tanks, and terrain features, offering a three-dimensional understanding of the coming assault. The generals walked among these displays, eyes narrowing, absorbing every detail, knowing that every decision made in these rooms could determine the lives of thousands of men storming the beaches just weeks away. Meetings with British commanders offered insight into the mind of the operation. Officers spoke with quiet authority, yet with an undercurrent of urgency, outlining contingencies for every conceivable scenario. Delays caused by weather, unexpected German defenses, equipment failures, and human error. The American generals listened intently, occasionally interrupting with questions, scribbling notes furiously, realizing that the integration of multiple national forces was a delicate balancing act requiring diplomacy, foresight, and unshakable discipline. Communication networks were a marvel in themselves. Telegraph lines, radio systems, and signal posts stretched across the countryside, connecting headquarters with field units in real time. Generals were shown encrypted messages, code books, and dispatch procedures, each system designed to relay information with maximum speed and security. The speed of coordination was staggering. Within minutes, orders could be transmitted across hundreds of miles, synchronizing artillery barrages, airstrikes, and troop movements in perfect harmony. The Americans could hardly conceal their astonishment. They were also introduced to the integration of multinational forces. British, Canadian, and American officers worked side by side, their dialogue blending different tactics, doctrines, and military cultures into a single operational plan. Differences in language, procedure, and equipment could have been disastrous, yet the leadership had forged cohesion through repeated drills, shared briefings, and a relentless focus on the common objective. The generals realized that this level of cooperation, maintained under intense pressure, was unprecedented. In one striking demonstration, the generals observed the rehearsal of a coordinated assault. Landing craft moved in precise sequences, while artillery units fired in calculated waves, and fighter planes streaked across the sky to provide air cover. Officers monitored progress with stopwatches and maps, adjusting timings and sequences to account for every possible variation. The sheer precision and timing left the generals awestruck. It was not just strategy, it was a symphony of coordination, every element performing its part flawlessly, yet capable of improvisation when necessity demanded. Meetings behind closed doors further emphasized the stakes. The generals were briefed on how to allocate reserves, respond to unexpected resistance, and manage casualties. They observed discussions about contingencies so detailed they bordered on obsession, which beaches might flood, which artillery positions were vulnerable, which supply depots were critical. Each conversation was a balancing act between caution and boldness, highlighting the razor-edge nature of the upcoming invasion. The weight of responsibility pressed down on everyone in the room. Perhaps most impressive to the American generals was the synchronization of deception with real operations. Intelligence reports, dummy deployments, and real troop movements were meticulously interwoven to create the illusion of multiple threats, keeping German forces uncertain and reactive. Command and coordination were no longer abstract concepts. They were a living, pulsating mechanism, functioning seamlessly across land, sea, and air. The generals noted that success would depend as much on flawless communication and timing as on bravery in combat. By afternoon, the generals were guided to a large operations center, where dozens of officers monitored the day's drills, radio transmissions, and simulated engagements. Each officer had a defined role, yet remained alert for anomalies requiring instant adaptation. The Americans could see the level of discipline and situational awareness demanded of leadership in real time. It was a network of control, resilience, and responsiveness, the backbone of a campaign that would decide the fate of Europe. As the sun dipped low over the English landscape, casting long shadows across the camp, the generals paused to reflect. They had seen the intricate machinery of command in action: planning rooms, maps, communications, rehearsals, and the delicate interweaving of multinational forces. They understood that victory would not be won by heroism alone, nor by sheer numbers. It would be achieved through the relentless execution of meticulous coordination, strategic foresight, and the unyielding will to synchronize every element of war toward a singular purpose. The American generals left that day with a mixture of awe and sobering realization. Britain's preparations were not just impressive, they were extraordinary. The seamless integration of strategy, logistics, intelligence, and training revealed the magnitude of the challenge ahead. D-Day was no longer a concept on paper. It was a living, breathing operation, poised to unfold with precision, audacity, and a high human cost. And within that realization came a quiet understanding. When the moment came, there would be no second chances, only the unrelenting demand for courage, judgment, and coordination at every level. The evening sky over southern England was heavy with clouds, a grey canvas mirroring the gravity that weighed upon the minds of the American generals. After weeks of observing Britain's preparations, the sprawling camps, the meticulously organized logistics, the rehearsals, and the flawless orchestration of command, they found themselves in a rare, contemplative silence. The scale of what they had witnessed was staggering, yet the reality of the coming invasion pressed upon them with an almost physical force. Soon, thousands of men would embark on a journey from these shores to a foreign coast, their fates intertwined with months of planning, strategy, and sheer human endurance. They walked along the cliff edges overlooking the channel, the cold wind whipping around them, carrying the scent of salt, seaweed, and distant smoke from training exercises. Below, the shoreline was a hive of activity. Landing craft were being checked, engineers adjusted obstacles, and soldiers rehearsed maneuvers, their figures small against the vastness of sand and surf. The generals observed in silence, aware that these scenes of preparation were the calm before the storm, a prelude to chaos, courage, and sacrifice. Inside briefing rooms, maps and charts had been updated for the last time before the invasion. Pins marked divisions, strings traced routes of advance, and annotations detailed contingencies for every conceivable setback. The generals studied these maps, imagining the chaos that would soon unfold: the roar of artillery, the smoke and fire of naval bombardments, the cries of men fighting for survival. The precision of the plans offered some comfort, yet the weight of responsibility was inescapable. One wrong move, one delayed order, could ripple through the entire operation, turning preparation into catastrophe. Their reflections turned inward, contemplating the human dimension of the war. They had seen soldiers drilled to perfection, yet they understood that even the most disciplined troops would face fear and confusion on D-Day. Casualties would be inevitable, and the cost in lives would be immense. The generals felt the duality of their position, awe at the brilliance of British planning, and sobering responsibility for the men under their command. The lives of thousands were about to intersect with months of preparation, and the burden of leadership weighed heavily on their shoulders. They spoke little, exchanging only quiet words of observation and concern. Each general carried an unspoken recognition of the enormity of history about to be made. Britain had prepared with meticulous attention to detail, from dummy tanks in fields to coordinated supply lines stretching across the countryside. Yet even the most comprehensive plans could not eliminate the uncertainties of war. Tides, weather, enemy resistance, human error, all factors that would soon be tested under fire. Twilight descended, the generals were led to a quiet observation point overlooking the English camps. Lanterns flickered in the gathering darkness, casting long shadows over tents and vehicles. The rhythmic hum of activity below was a constant reminder that preparation never ceased, even in the calm hours before the storm. The sight was humbling. thousands of men moving with purpose, every action contributing to a larger design, every life intertwined with a plan that could determine the fate of nations. In that moment, the generals reflected on the paradox of war. Britain's D-Day preparations were an awe-inspiring testament to human ingenuity, discipline, and foresight. Every decoy, every supply depot, every rehearsal was evidence of a nation committed to victory. Yet they also knew that the coming invasion would be a crucible. Courage and strategy would collide with chaos and carnage. The generals felt the weight of anticipation, a mixture of admiration for what had been achieved and sobering awareness of the trials yet to come. As night fell, the channel stretched before them like a dark, endless ribbon, the water reflecting the dim glow of distant lights. The generals could almost feel the enormity of the undertaking, the convergence of land, sea, and air in a single decisive moment. They understood that the meticulous preparation, the rehearsals, the deception, and the coordination were all leading to this instant, a collision of human will, strategy, and chance. History was poised on the edge, and they were witnesses and participants alike. In the silence that followed, the generals realized the profound truth of what they had observed. Britain's preparations were more than plans on paper or drills in the sand. They were a testament to human perseverance, ingenuity, and courage, forged in the knowledge that the days to come would test every assumption, every decision, and every life involved. And in that quiet reflection, they understood that when the first wave hit the beaches of Normandy, the storm would be relentless, history would be made, and the world would never be the same.